Good morning, and I just kind of wish the Virhuses could just read every scripture ever. That was unbelievable. Can you narrate bedtime stories for families? We'll pay you. If we haven't met, my name's Dave. We're so glad you're here. We're going to dive into the continued story of the last week of Jesus' life on earth. And it's like a couple of Good Friday services in a row, and it's been really rich for me. But before we get into this passage that we just read, I'd like you to turn to your neighbor, and I'd like you just to share with them, what's the worst movie you have ever seen? So just turn and just what's the worst movie you've ever seen? Go ahead and talk about that for a second, and we'll come back together. All right. We could probably talk for a while about this. This is a fun convo. Hey, just for curiosity, I just want to spend the whole service time talking about terrible movies. Anybody brave enough to just yell out one that you just hated? Anybody? Somebody said Die Hard? Get out. No, just kidding. All are welcome, even sinners. Okay, good. Anybody have one a movie they just hated? They just couldn't take it. It was the worst movie they've ever seen. Really? Guns of Navarone. That's kind of a famous film, isn't it? All right, fair enough. The Exorcist. Yeah, for nightmare-inducing, that certainly is true. That's not like a movie you watch again. That's not a fun rewatchable. Yeah. Anybody else? No? Okay. Let me tell you one of mine. I was thinking about this. I don't know if this is the right answer, but this is the one that came to my mind. I was thinking about the movie I hated the most and the worst movie I've ever seen. Might be slightly different. I think the worst movie I've ever seen was, these were both in the late 90s, which is saying something. It was a 1999 film called Wild Wild West, starring Will Smith and Kenneth Branagh and Kevin Kline and Selma Hayek. It has an all-star cast. It is horrific, all right? It's a Western that ends with a giant mechanical spider riding off into the sunset. When your Western ends with a giant mechanical spider riding off into the sunset, you have gone wrong, sir. You have gone wrong. I saw this movie on a plane for free, and I felt cheated, like I should get my money back. I was so angry. The thing is, the movie starts with this incredible song. It's got an amazing soundtrack, but just terrible film. All-star cast, terrible film. But the movie, I hated this movie. I hated this movie so much. It was just a year before. It was called City of Angels. I hated this film. It starred Nicolas Cage and Meg Ryan. Now, Nicolas Cage was coming off an Oscar win for Leaving Las Vegas. Giant movie star, Con Air, right? And America's Sweetheart, coming off of You've Got Mail, Meg Ryan. Incredible. This is going to be, and they build it as a love story, as a romantic film. Bring your date. It'll be amazing. And I went to it, and the premise is Nicolas Cage is there, and he's an angel, and he gives up all angelic, divinity to come to earth and become a normal human being because he falls in love with Meg Ryan, which makes sense. They fall in love. She's America's sweetheart, people. And so there, they fall in love, and it becomes an incredible thing. And she's so in bliss in life, she's riding her bicycle. And if I'm going to spoil it, but it's 25 years old, so if you didn't want me to spoil it, you should have seen it in the last 25 years. So I feel no guilt. She closes her eyes, and she's riding her bicycle, and she gets hit by a logging truck and dies. They killed America's sweetheart. I hated it so much. But there's one good thing that came out of this film. There was the song, the kind of lead song in this film, on the soundtrack, and it became one of the biggest songs of the 90s. It was a song that's actually shockingly deep and really profound. It's by the Goo Goo Dolls. It's called Iris. And I'm going to just play the quick chorus of this song because it gets into what we're talking about. There it is. All right, I don't want the world to see me because I don't think that they'd understand. When everything's made to be broken, I just want you to know who I am. This song gets to the core and the heart and the tension of what it means to be human. I want to hide. I don't want you to see me because I'm afraid of how you will react. And yet, I know that this world is broken, and at the end of it, I desperately want to be seen, and I want you to know who I am. There's this tension. We want to be known, and yet we hide. We hide, and therefore we cannot be known. This is a central human tension. Hiding, fear of being known. Tim Keller, in his famous book, The Meaning of Marriage, put it this way, and I think this is about as good as it can be put. To be loved but not known is comforting, but superficial. To be known and not loved is our greatest fear. But to be fully known and truly loved is, well, a lot like being loved by God. It's what we need more than anything. This idea that is put forth by this song from a 1998 film is a human idea. It's a human reality. And the word behind it, that fear of being known and being rejected, or the reality of putting yourself out there and getting rejected, is a pretty common word. It's the word shame. Researcher and author Brene Brown, who does a ton of work on shame and a lot of research on vulnerability, defines shame as this. Shame is the intensely painful feeling that we are unworthy of love and belonging. It happens when you are rejected. And I got to say this, shame is not something that some people struggle with or have experienced. Shame is something all of us have experienced. The rejection, the feeling of not being good enough, or smart enough, or successful enough, the sense of feeling you're not good enough or worthy of love, the sense of rejection, it happens to all of us. And this feeling of shame causes us to hide. This feeling of shame causes us to go inside. And this feeling of shame is death. It causes us to shrink away. And in Matthew 26, we see a story in many ways about shame. But I'm very grateful for this story that Matthew put it in because it shows us not only the way into shame, but the way out as a uniquely Christian perspective. Let's read it again in Matthew 26. Right before that passage that the Virus has read, Jesus is having his Last Supper with his disciples. And then Jesus told them, this very night, you will all fall away on account of me. For it's written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. And Jesus continues, but after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. And then Peter replied, even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. Ah, Peter. And then Jesus says, truly I tell you, Jesus answered, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the other disciples said the same. You know how the story goes. How long did this promise last? Hours. Hours until Peter's most fervent pledge to Jesus of fealty and allegiance. He's disowning him 3 times. There's a number of lessons from this story. First, I think we all tend to dramatically overestimate how strong, capable, and faithful to Jesus we are. All of us do. All of us. All of us overestimate how good we are, how strong our relationship to Jesus is, how good we can hold on to him. And then the story goes on. And Jesus is arrested. And we begin to get glimpses of the cracks in Peter's armor, even as Jesus is arrested. It goes on in Matthew 26 and verse 57. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had been assembled. And then these little details that Matthew puts in. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome, to see what was going to happen. Peter is trying to follow from a distance, wondering if being far away will somehow be safe for him. And there's another lesson here, ladies and gentlemen. Trying to follow the crucified one without having anything bad happen to you is quite impossible. It just doesn't work. And Peter's about to get thrown into the fire. And then we saw Matthew 26. Now Peter was sitting in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. You were also with Jesus the Galilee, she said. But he denied it before them all. I don't know what you're talking about. Then he went out to the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. And he denied it again with an oath. He's swearing now. I don't know the man. After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, surely you're one of them. Your accent gives you away. And he began to call down curses and swore to them, I don't know this man. And then a rooster crowed, and Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And then this final line, and he went outside and wept bitterly. The sense of being outside the city, outside the gates, outside is a sense of isolation, of darkness, and then the wept bitterly, deep sorrow, deep broken sorrow. Peter is now aware of who he is. There's another lesson here. We are all more broken than we wish or even care to admit. This is Peter's story, but it's also ours. But there's something else that's going on in this story, a reaction that we have to it. I find it fascinating that Matthew completely drops Peter from the story. He doesn't appear again. He's gone. And you're like, well, that makes sense. Look how much he failed. He's gone. And we do something similar in our own hearts and minds. Man, that Peter, he royally messed up. And sometimes, because I think we know we're broken, we know that we might do the same thing, we kind of kill Peter over there and say, man, that guy messed up big time. And that's a self-protective mechanism, right? Like, hey, this guy, I'm going to be honest, if it were me, I probably would have done something different. I don't know about you. And so what do? We do the exact same thing that Peter just did, right? We overestimate our own. But the reason why is because, I think, the total failure of Peter causes a reaction inside of us. We see his failure and we hate it because I think it reminds us of us. We all know that we, like Peter, have not held on to Jesus. We betrayed him and denied him in various ways, big and small. Maybe not giant failures like Peter, but we know if we're honest with our lives, we're not much better than Peter. And so that creates this tension inside of us that we start to project outward, and we say, man, I don't like this Peter guy. I don't know what's going on. I first encountered this reality in a book I used to teach. I was a high school English teacher. There's a famous book. I love it. I think it's fantastic, especially for high school students. It's called Catcher in the Rye. Some people hate this book because Holden Caulfield is a teenage boy, and spending that much time with the interior life of a teenage boy is difficult. Let us be honest. But Holden, if anything, is pretentious, but he also is deeply honest. This is what he says about the disciples. He says, he's talking about Jesus and his followers. He says, take the disciples, for instance. They annoy the hell out of me, if you want to know the truth. They were all right after Jesus was dead and all, but while he was alive, they were about as much use to him as a hole in the head. And isn't this true? Ashley Cleveland, who is a Grammy Award-winning Christian artist, wrote a book called Little Black Sheep, in which she talks about this brokenness. And I want to talk about this brokenness because this brokenness that Peter has, that we see in the story, that we analyze in the story, that we reject in the story, we know it's not right, that we also realize and recognize in our own hearts and lives, that can cause us real tension. She says this, I assumed that in coming to faith, my cracks and splits would be sewn together again in a seamless, saint-like fabric. But such is not the case. Much like the Velveteen Rabbit, I am a series of threadbare patches, irregular stitches, with the stuffing poking out and one button eye displaced and downcast. I have serious issues with this. I have despised my brokenness and cry out to God regularly and petulantly, particularly after a public display of contempt, shame, greed, gluttony, grandiosity, or insensitivity. Would it be such a big deal to relieve me of some of this? Could you make me a little less broken? The answer that I perceive is always the same. No. More broken. See, the issue is we don't deal with our own brokenness. And like Peter, we make promises around a table to Jesus when we know we can't keep it. And another thing we do, Scott McKnight in his commentary on Matthew put it this way. He said, we'd rather pelt one another with humiliating words than build up the temple of God as living and broken stones of the one who was humiliated for each of us. The fact that Ashley had been made to feel like a black sheep, as if she were the oddball in the game of Christianity, proves that this is what we would rather do. Despite the fact that we all sin, we all fall short of the glory of God, we know this. These things are a source of shame. And we think the best thing to do is hide them and pretend as if they don't happen. Because that's what it means to be a really good follower, is to not mess up like this. And so, what we try to do with our shame and our own brokenness is tuck it away in the privacy of our own disappointment. That's what we try to do. But this never works. It never works. And the other thing that I've seen, maybe in my own life and maybe you've seen, that the shame that we feel in ourselves, it causes us to attack ourselves. We know that we have fallen. And then if we are attacking ourselves and are ungracious and unkind and don't, then what do? We start attacking other people. Because if we can't live up to it, if we're broken, then we see somebody else is broken, then that just flows that way. There's these two memes that I encountered online, and I share them with my wife. And I think that they're brilliant, but they're also deeply painful. I'm going to share them. One's for her, one's for me. And we make this joke in our house. I love this. This is the first one. This is hers. It says, "Oh, you're a perfectionist? Tell me 3 things you do perfectly." Any perfectionists in the room? And then this one, this is for me. "Oh, you're a people pleaser? Tell me 3 people who are pleased with you." It hurts because it's true, right? The whole point of perfectionists is they know that they can never, ever be perfect. And so it hurts. And it's a never-ending treadmill. And the thing about people-pleasing is you can never do enough to please people. And you know it, this is the deep wounds. So this is how we are. This is where we're stuck. This is what we see when we see Peter's failure. This is how we react. And this is the world, full of shame and hiding, full of numbing out from the pain, full of blaming of others. Like in the garden, we see shame and blame. Our world is filled with finger pointing. Like we're about to enter an election season where the other side is going to be responsible for 100% of the problems. We're going to see this played out. Tons of shame. Luckily, this is not the way of Jesus. Jesus does not deal with Peter this way. Other gospel writers reveal a little bit more insight, and they do something a little interesting and a little bit more insight. In Luke's gospel, for example, in the same story, there's this little aside that Luke puts in that Matthew does not. I think it's fascinating. I think it reveals something about Jesus in his heart. He says, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you all as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." First of all, do you see the delicacy, the Simon, Simon, the tenderness? My boy, my friend, Simon, Simon. Then he reveals a spiritual reality that we're not really even aware of, that the shame is actually an enemy. The name for God's enemy is Satan, but translated, it's translated into the accuser. And what's his primary weapon? Lies. Lies that accuse. That sounds a lot to me like shame. I know people who have been locked in shame for decades by a single lie. My dad doesn't want me, therefore I'm unlovable. She left me, so that means that I'm not worthy. I mean, the same lie for decades, because the accuser keeps throwing that dart. And then I love this. I prayed for you that your faith might not fail. And then I love this. And when you've turned back, when you've returned, when you've repented, when you've come back home, after this experience, when you come back, which Jesus is like saying, because I know you're going to come back, you're going to be restored from this. Use that experience to strengthen your brothers, because they're going through the same thing, buddy. I love that. But that's not where we are in Matthew. In Matthew, Peter just disappears. And you think, well, that's how it should be. Peter's failed. He's out of the story. He's out of the narrative. There's no more for him. The other Gospels, John and Luke, tell about the tenderness of Jesus. John, in particular, goes deep into Peter's restoration. You know that story. Jesus is really intentional about restoring Peter. But I think Matthew is trying to show us something different. I think Matthew is trying to show us a different, slightly different angle. And that's why all the Gospels work together, and they're beautiful. In Matthew, Peter just disappears. But it's not just Peter who fails. I think Matthew, look what Matthew puts in. Then Jesus told them, this very night, you will all fall away on account of me. Who fails Jesus in the Matthew Gospel? Who fails Jesus in the Gospel? All of them. All of them. We think about Judas as the big betrayer, right? But who else betrays Jesus? Peter, the lead disciple, right? They all do. They all fall away. And then I think about that rooster crowing. For Peter, that rooster crowing is a powerful reminder of his abject failure to be faithful to Jesus. I mean, it breaks him. He hears it. That rooster is a symbol. It's a reminder of Peter's failure. But Matthew doesn't end his gospel with Peter's failure. I love the way that Matthew continues on, because I think it's a message for all of us. Like, who fails Jesus in this story? All of them. The best of the best. These are the people who walked with Jesus, who lived with Jesus, who walked with Jesus for 3 years, right? I mean, if anybody had a good chance to be faithful to Jesus, it's the people who walked and talked with him, right? And how many of them are faithful? How many of them can do it? 0. And yet, what does Jesus do? He marches to the cross. Why? Because of them. Because of us. We all fail. And Jesus still marches to the cross. All of us are unfaithful to God. And Jesus still marches to the cross. We all let him down. And he still marches to the cross. We betray him in word and deed by what we do and what we don't do. And he still marches to the cross. Because in the end, it's not about how hard or how fast we can hold on to God's hand. That's not where our salvation comes. It comes in how hard he hangs on to our hand. And he never lets go. And that is good news. Because even the strongest and the best of us in this room have had moments when our faith has failed and we have let go of God's hand. But he has never let go of ours. I find it interesting in the early church, this idea of a rooster actually shows up quite a bit. This is a fresco in 200 AD, pretty early in the church. It's hard to see. I didn't paint it. But I don't know, can you see it? This is Jesus the Good Shepherd. In the early church, Jesus was almost always portrayed as the Good Shepherd. It's all over the place in Roman art, in the Basilica, all over in the ancient world. But do you see what's below the kind of the lantern there? Do you see what's below it? Do you see the rooster right there? That's in the fresco. There's a rooster. All through Europe, this is a famous church in Scotland. I don't know if you probably can't see it, but do you see what's on top, at the very top of the steeple, at the very, very top? There's a rooster. I think we can zoom in a little bit. Here's another one. It's a weather vane. These were on the top of churches in Germany and Europe. And the reason why is because it became a symbol not of Peter's failure, but of God's goodness. The rooster announces the dawn. The rooster announces the break of light, the resurrection. But the rooster also announces that it's a new day. And what does Lamentations say about the rising of the sun? The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new. When? Every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. And the rooster at the very top, at the pinnacle of the church steeple, is watching for the light to come. And it always comes because God is faithful. So in some crazy ways, eventually what happens to Peter is the sign, the rooster, that rooster crowing, which was a sign of his abject failure and brokenness before God, becomes an entirely different symbol of God's faithfulness, that Jesus beat death, that on the third day, at the dawn of the third day, in the morning of that third day, Jesus comes up and his mercies are new every morning, and life does not stop because Jesus beat death. And he did that for Peter. He did that for the disciples. He did that for all of us. So in a weird way, that rooster became an inverse symbol. Just like the cross is a symbol of Roman destruction and death, but we wear it around our necks. Why? Because it wasn't about death. It was about Jesus going to the cross and then beating death. It became flipped, inverted, reclaimed. I don't know because the story doesn't tell us this, but later on we do see in John's gospel the incredible restoration of Peter. Jesus sits down privately with him at a fire and asks him 3 questions, which Peter answers in the affirmative. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And he says yes 3 times. And although I'm terrible at math, I do know that -3 plus 3 equals a fresh start. And Peter walks into that. This rooster becomes a symbol of God's never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever kind of love. So what does this mean for us? Some thoughts and then we'll close. As I've been reflecting on this, 4 things that this reality of God's ability to break shame. The first is that there should be no pretense in prayer. You know, early on in my walk, I really thought that I had to clean up my story. I could not be honest with God. If I actually was honest with God in prayer about who I actually was and what I was actually thinking, what I was afraid of, that somehow God would be so disappointed that he would reject me. Honesty before God wasn't an option. I really thought I had to clean myself up. And so this really limited my prayer life. Now, this is foolish because, it's hard to hide from God in general because he's omniscient, but I thought I could. That's no way to live, and it's no way to approach God. C.S. Lewis famously said, "The prayer before all prayers that precedes all prayers is this: may it be the real I who speaks to you, and may it be the real you that I talk to." Maybe you feel like you can't even be honest with what's actually going on in your life, what's going on in your heart, what's gone on in the past or in the present, or you're worried about in the future. I want to get better. David says this in one of his Psalms, "Search me, O Lord, search me." That's an invitation. Second, I think that this is a reminder that there is healing for deep wounds and failures. One of the things that's hard about this is a lot of people walk through life and they actually stuff down their own shame. And they run after other stuff like achievement, or they numb out and they just kind of ignore the pain of this. So the first part is knowing and acknowledging, man, I deal with this. But then we can't stay there. Like, knowing is only half the battle. There's an invitation for Jesus to get healed. So it's not enough just to know that you're broken. I think that Jesus' invitation is to walk into healing with him. Do the work, and Jesus will help. Third thing, I'm not saying this should happen everywhere. Like, I understand that complete authenticity and vulnerability is not really possible with everybody, nor should it be. But I really pray that we create pockets of vulnerability in our church, with life groups and with friendships, where we can actually be vulnerable, because the antidote to shame is vulnerability. And then lastly, as we experience that love, as we experience that forgiveness, I pray that we demonstrate to others shocking, uncommon acceptance. In a world full of shaming and turning away and rejection, I pray that we would not be shocked by anything, and instead invite people to the only antidote that I've ever encountered for shame in this world, which is God. A while ago, I was out at a men's retreat. This is last October. And it was a powerful moment, and I was talking about the rejection of young men by their fathers. And I had so many people just weeping. Men who had received messages from their father. You're not good enough. I don't love you. I abandon you. I'm out. You're not worthy of me sticking around. So many men experience this deep wound. And when it's your dad, it doesn't matter if the entire church stood up and said, "You're good enough." The collective voices of an entire community would never be enough to counteract the message from their own father. There's no voice in this world that's stronger than the voice of a father or a mother in a kid's life. That is their source of life. There's no voice in this world. Well, there is one. There's one voice. A voice above all. A voice that created us all. A voice that not just created us, but then went to a cross and died for us and invites us out of shame and out of hiding. That's the voice that can heal. Romans 15, Paul tries to instruct us and says this. He says, "Accept one another, just as Christ accepted you, in order to bring praise to God." I want to be this kind of people. I want to be this kind of people. And it's only possible, I think Paul knows, through the power and the work of God to destroy shame and to deal with our wounds. We're going to invite the prayer team up, and we're going to invite the worship team up, and we're going to sing some songs. And I didn't mean to stir up pain, but I know that it's possible that you might need to do some work with God. We're going to provide some space for you to pray in the silence of this place. And then over there, it's kind of weird. Hey, if you experience shame, go stand up and walk in the middle of everybody and then talk to Priscilla. But if this is something that's stirring something up, we'd love to pray with you. If this is something you deal with. Or if this is something you want to pray with. Maybe there's somebody you know that is trapped in shame. We want to invite you to this. And the only power that I know is God's Spirit to help us. God's voice is the voice that destroys shame. Jesus' voice. So let me pray. Let's pray for us, and then we'll spend some time together. God, I thank you for the story of Peter. And he failed big time. But his story didn't end. Because in the end, it wasn't about how faithful Peter could be, but about how good and loving and faithful you are. I know there's people in this room who have experienced rejection and pain in life. And the messages that have been sent to them, big and small, are that they're not good enough, that they're unworthy, that no one loves them, that no one could love them, that they're too broken, they're too... And Jesus, I think that those are messages from the enemy. They're not your voice. So I pray that your voice would speak. Pull out those fiery arrows from the accuser and begin to heal us.